Now, leadership is a subject that I've been speaking about and preaching about for years. And often during my devotional times, I'll focus on a Bible character and spend weeks, actually, usually months, just soaking myself with that leader. And that's where this Nehemiah series came from. And I've studied Paul, spent a lot of months with Moses. And I was realizing yesterday that I developed a whole series on leading with Moses, leading in impossible circumstances, learning from Moses. But an interesting contrast, several of the lessons we learned from Moses are actually negative. In other words, don't do what Moses did if you want to be a good leader. And you can think of the obvious cases of that. But with Nehemiah, I haven't found any negative lessons yet on Nehemiah. So he makes a really good model for us to follow. But here's what we saw yesterday. After Nehemiah learned about the awful situation in Jerusalem, he risked everything because of his zeal for the honor of God's name and his sorrow that the walls of Jerusalem had been destroyed and the gates had been burned. And he left, it was leaving his kinsmen unprotected. So he left his cushy job and made the 1,500-mile, 2-month journey from the winter palace at Susa down through Babylon and then across to Damascus and arrived in Jerusalem. But even before he arrives in Jerusalem, he's already getting opposition. Sound familiar? So today we look at Nehemiah on site as a leader, an organizer, a planner, a hard worker. So let's start by just reading chapter 2, verses 11 through 20. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went out through the valley gate, toward the jackal well, and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and the gates which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through, so I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So, I love these words, they began this good work. But when Sanballat, the Horonite, Tobiah, the Ammonite official, and Geshem, the Arab, heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. So Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem 445 BC, 13 years after Ezra had arrived. And we immediately see that godly leaders are prudent and wise. I mean, yesterday we saw that godly leaders take risks, but this does not mean they are not prudent, wise in making their decisions and in acting. I mean, think about this. Nehemiah arrives and he waits 3 days before he does anything, probably getting over jet lag. He doesn't arrive with any big fanfare, no big speeches. Okay, people, I'm here. I'm here to solve your problems. No big speech. You're a bunch of losers. You're living in this broken down ghetto with all these broken walls. No, he said nothing. He had said nothing to anyone about his plans. In other words, Nehemiah knew when to speak and when to be quiet. Now, that's a lesson that many leaders, unfortunately, never learn. Many leaders talk way too much and way too early. And besides, some things are better not publicized prematurely, because a new leader can easily alienate his group before he even gets started by saying too much, too soon. But the wise leader, the godly leader, is prudent, circumspect. Because Nehemiah came to Jerusalem with a burden and a vision to rebuild the wall and repopulate the city. But reality is always a little different than the imagination. So when you take a new job, when you start a new project, or begin pastoring a new church, or you're starting a new Compass Europe project, be cautious about declaring too much too soon. I've seen many new leaders flounder because their mouth was bigger than their ability. And that's not only offensive to God, it's offensive to other people. So we see Nehemiah's prudence and wisdom later on in chapter 6. And you remember the story when this so-called prophet has a word from the Lord for Nehemiah. We've got to meet. People are going to kill you. We got to meet. And Nehemiah wisely says, no. Simple lesson here. Don't be gullible. Be wise. Some leaders so desperately want to believe the best about everything, and they think it's wrong to be suspicious or ask questions or to think badly of anyone. And so they're foolishly taken in by bad people. I know this temptation. I know it very well because I'm kind of a gullible guy myself. I'm not very clever, and I don't have really great discernment a lot of times. I want to trust people. That's my natural stance. I want to trust them until they just practically knocked me over with mistrust. But after 51 years, hopefully, I've learned a few lessons. I've had close colleagues lie to me. I've had them lie about me. I've had them undercut me behind my back. Now, thankfully, I'm blessed with a wonderful wife that has the gift of discernment. And I've learned, took time, I've learned to listen to her and trust her judgment as well. But ask the Holy Spirit for discernment. We dare not forget that we and all of our colleagues still have total depravity, even after being born again and filled with the Holy Spirit. Be wise. Several years ago, I realized one of the leaders of a ministry I was with lied constantly. I mean, constantly. I confronted him repeatedly, and there was no change. He actually defended lying. And finally, I realized I had to cut all ties with that organization, even though I'd spent years working with them, because I didn't want my own reputation sullied by his lying. It wasn't unforgiveness or bitterness. Well, I probably had to struggle with that a little bit sometimes, but it was protecting the integrity of my own name. So even when somebody claims to have a word from the Lord, be discerning to know which is true and which is false. Godly leaders need to be wise. We need to be prudent and learn to say no. Just because somebody wants to meet, it doesn't mean you have to meet. Learn to say no. So ponder. Think about a time when you spoke when you should have been silent. Now, for me, that's an easy one. That's very easy, but that's something to ponder. But we also learned that godly leaders do their research. Nehemiah got the facts. I mean, you remember even in his earlier presentation to the king, we read that account yesterday. It was obvious Nehemiah had not only been praying, he had been getting the facts. He had been doing research about the situation. He not only knew the need, he not only knew the problem, he knew what was required to rebuild the wall. And that was from 1,500 miles away. He knew how much time it would take. He knew what resources he would need. He even knew what documents he needed. He had done his homework. But when he arrived, he made no assumptions. He did more fact-finding on site. So without telling anyone, he takes a few close associates at night and makes his own inspection, riding around the 1.5 to 2.5 mile length around the walls. He took time to assess the need and the situation. And what he saw was bad. This was indeed going to be a massive project because the walls needed to be 3 to 4 feet thick at the top, of course, much wider at the bottom, 15 to 20 feet high. And right now, the huge blocks were strewn all over the place, often rolling down into the valley below. It was a massive reconstruction project, but he was ready. Now, just because God gives you a vision for a Compass Europe project or a new church or a ministry or a business doesn't mean you don't need to do your research. God will not tell you things you can find out for yourself, and God will not do for you what you can do. So I'd just ask you this, all of you are facing current projects and needs. What facts do you need to gather to accomplish what God has called you to do next? But next we see that godly leaders clearly articulate the problem and the solution. Now, Nehemiah has inspected the wall himself. He's seen how badly things are. And only now does he go public. But I want you to watch him. We learn good lessons about public relations from Nehemiah. First of all, good leaders identify with their people. You notice how he said, look at the trouble we are in. Come, let us rebuild the wall. We will no longer be in disgrace. He identified with the people. Now, he could have said, you people, you're a bunch of losers. You've been living with this mess. How could you do this? You have a big problem. But no, he said, we. He had been there 4 days by then. And we see the word we all the way through the book of Nehemiah. There's never the distance of, well, I was second in command, actually, of the whole empire, and I've come here to solve your problems. No, it was always we. He could have isolated himself as an elitist, the big man from Babylon, come in to solve the problem. But no, he kept close to the people. And godly leaders explain the problem clearly. Have you ever been in a business meeting where there was a crisis and you went away as confused about the crisis as you were when you walked in? because nobody clearly articulated the problem. Now, these people had probably gotten used to it. So he had to explain the seriousness of the situation. And then he proposed specific, definite action. Come, let us rebuild the wall. Not let's form a committee, not let's take a vote and see what we want to do here. Not let's think about it for a while and see what. No, it's a challenge. Let's rebuild the wall. Time was of essence. Now, if we had time, we would stop and do this one, but to write down in 15 words or less the main problem you're facing in your work, and then 15 words or less the specific actions you need to take. But next we see that godly leaders motivate. Now, all of us have worked with leaders who give orders. I've worked with a lot of people who love to give orders. They give commands, they make demands. Other leaders whine and complain. But the best leaders neither order, nor command, nor demand, nor whine. They motivate. And how do they do that? Well, we have a master class here in motivation. Actually, Nehemiah's name means the Lord comforts. And Nehemiah came along to comfort these people because he arrived when progress had halted on Jerusalem's repair and the people were understandably discouraged. They needed help. But it's interesting the kind of comfort that Nehemiah gives them. He didn't just give them some empty words and spiritual platitudes. Most of us are pretty good at that. We've learned it well. Actually, hardly anything of what he says seems comforting. But he assured them simply, God has called us to a great task, and we need to get busy. He assured them the wall can be rebuilt, and he gave them a reason. So we will no longer be in disgrace. So he gives them a plan, a motivation, and a rationale. And he motivated them with God's faithfulness. There's no greater motivation than that. The gracious hand of my God was upon me. And then later in verse 20, he says, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. And they needed motivating. Some of this repair had been sitting for 100 years. I mean, we're talking 2 or 3 generations of people that had lived and died with the walls being in the sad state they were in. They had tried before, and they just couldn't get the job done. And they had gotten accustomed to living in the ruins. They were comfortable in their ghetto. No need to change. It's been this way all of our lives. I used to have a book, The 7 Last Words of a Church. The 7 last words of a church are, we've never done it that way before. So never underestimate your need as a leader to motivate your people. Don't underestimate it. Now, why do I say that? Well, because I'm in a room that I suspect almost all of us are self-starters. We are motivated. I mean, that's why we're here. We have a vision. We have a calling. We have a purpose to spread financial discipleship all over Europe. We don't really need a lot of motivation. We may need some training and some propping up occasionally, but we don't need motivation. We're leaders. And so we forget that not everybody else is self-motivated or God-motivated, as the case is. Most people need motivating to get on board with the project. So we need to challenge. We need to explain, why is this worthwhile? And I'm not talking about shallow, rah-rah pep talks, but passionately, rationally making the case for why we should join together for this great work. A leader who cannot inspire is not truly a leader at all. He may be a manager, a boss, a supervisor, but not a leader. The leader inspires. The leader motivates. And look, Nehemiah's motivation worked. The people responded, let us start rebuilding. And so they began this good work. Those are delicious words. And later on, we see Nehemiah had to, again, remotivate the people in the middle of a crisis when all their enemies were gathered around them, threatening to wipe them out. And so in chapter 4, verse 14, he says, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. He's motivating. He didn't need motivating because he had the perspective that Emoke gave us last night, that we have thankfulness, we have contentment, we have hope, but he knows they needed to remember that. Now, some leaders are introverts. I know because I am one. And some leaders tend to burrow down their heads in their shell and just work away because they're self-motivated, doing their work, assuming everybody else is going to keep doing their work. I know because I've done that often as a leader myself. But as leaders, we don't have that luxury. Just because we know what's happening and we know why it needs to be done doesn't mean we need to stop communicating why the job needs to be done. Communicate, especially in difficult times. Are you starting a new program? Communicate. Are you running tight on money? Communicate. Do you have tensions within the staff? Communicate. Do you have opposition and criticism from others? Communicate. A question. How can you motivate the people you work with right now for their task? Well, next we learn that good leaders, godly leaders, carefully plan and organize. Let me just read. I'd love to read all of chapter 3, but let's read verses 1 through 3, let's say. Chapter 3, 1 through 3. Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and as far as the Tower of Hananel. The men of Jericho built the adjoining section, and Zakur, son of Imri, built next to them. The fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassanah. They laid its beams and put its doors and bolts and bars in place, and the chapter goes on. This is an amazing chapter. You got to read it every word because it's a beautiful picture of careful planning, precise organization, sustained coordination. It's a lovely thing. If you love organizational development, you got to love this chapter. It's delicious. So Nehemiah got the project started. He didn't just talk about it. He didn't just pray about it. He didn't just plan for it. He and his team did it. Now, sadly, I've seen some Christian leaders that thought all they needed was a vision and everything else would just, well, voila, fall in place. But Nehemiah realized he had to do the hard work of planning and strategizing and organizing. Otherwise, it would be chaos. So he developed a plan. He divided the wall into 45 different sections, plus the 10 gates. Organizing the groups took time and effort. Arranging for the materials to be at each site took time and effort, but he did it. This was a very complex and difficult reconstruction project with all the gates and corners and uneven topography. It's hard for us to even grasp. Even if they had power equipment, it would have been an overwhelming job. But Nehemiah organized the workers. He clearly had done his research, both about the project and the people involved, and he planned his strategy, carefully organized each work group. And we see the phrase next to them all the way through this chapter. In other words, he knew where each person, where each team was working and what they needed to do. He understood that it was good to have people who were compatible to work together. They had a personal investment in that section because that's where they were living. And Nehemiah understood that it was good to have job descriptions. Every person needs to know what they're responsible for, what their job is. Many great ideas never become reality because no one does the hard work of strategizing and planning and organizing. It has to be done. But Nehemiah had a clear goal: rebuilding the wall. And better yet, he had a great plan and strategy. So ponder this. In 25 words or less, explain your plan for your current project. Have you assigned each worker or staff member a clear job description? Do they know how much money they can spend without permission? Do they know to whom they report? Do they know when they will be successful? And what is the goal of their current project? Well, next we see that good leaders recruit good workers. In chapter 3, we see the picture that the workers had also recruited people under them. So individuals who had named had found other people to work on their team. And look at the variety all the way through. We start with the priest. Oh, you mean preachers can do manual labor too? Whoa, that's revolutionary. So including the high priest himself, they were involved in building the wall. In verse 1, verse 17, verse 22, verse 26, 28. That's a lot of priests showing up for work. That's a good trend to see people in ministry actually working. That's a joke. And we see women helping to do the project. I mean, you think about what hard manual labor this is. And the women were right there alongside the men working away. Many people were working outside their area of expertise. I mean, think about this. We have perfume makers and goldsmiths working on the wall. Now, my guess is none of them had very much experience on a construction site, but they were there. There's a long way from being a perfume maker to laying bricks. That's a big difference, but they showed up. Now, in the US, for several years, spiritual gifts analyses were really popular. Everybody was taking them and recommending them. And then I suppose there's a place for some of that. But often in the real world, God assigns us to tasks that are well outside our gifts. We simply have to adapt and learn and work hard. I mean, during much of my 50 plus years in ministry, God has often given me jobs that I was ill-equipped for. Actually, there'd be very few jobs I would be well-equipped for, so that was not hard. But he was always asking me to do stuff I had no natural aptitude to do. And I can imagine that most of the people working on this project, if you said, do you have a spiritual gift of rebuilding walls? Probably none of them would have said, yes, that's my spiritual gift. But they were faithful and they did their work. And you see, Nehemiah commended the workers for their good work. So this is chapter 3 is an amazing list of workers and projects. So this tells us Nehemiah knew exactly who was doing what, where they were, and what they were doing. And it shows us Nehemiah was not this aloof boss who said, okay, everybody's organized now. I'm going to go for a coffee break. You give me a call if you got any problems. No, he was in the midst of them. So principle, assign and delegate, but stay engaged. He appointed good supervisors. So good supervisors in charge. Question to ponder. What workers are you lacking for your good work? Are you launching a new Compass Europe project? Then what helpers, what volunteers, what workers do you need? What is your plan for recruiting good workers or volunteers? And how do you commend your good workers? Well, then we see just an overall point, and that is godly work leaders work hard. We see this all the way through this. We hardly need to mention this work was exhausting, demanding. But chapter 4, verse 23, neither I nor my brothers nor my men nor my guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapon, even when we went for water. Chapter 5, verse 16, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. Now, some Christians think that if they just work hard, pray hard enough, they won't have to work hard. They view God as the only real worker. But we never in the Word see prayer and work as options. No surprise, though, Nehemiah had to cope with lazy people. Even in those days, you notice in chapter 3, verse 5, the next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. What a telling sign. Have you ever worked with lazy people? There's hardly anything more frustrating. Lazy people. It drives me crazy. It really tests my sanctification more than about anything. But the word work occurs, I just counted them up the other day, 21 times in chapters 2 through 7. This was backbreaking work. I grew up on a farm in the middle of America in Missouri, and I know something about hard work. That's why I decided not to be a farmer when I was very young. I know what it is to spend the day picking up rocks. Our farm grew rocks, and so I had to put them on a wagon and get them out of there so we could grow plants, digging fence post holes and working with pigs and cows, and that was just my brothers. It was hard work. This was hard manual labor. They wore blisters on their hand. They were sweating. It was not a pleasant task. But some people get so spiritual, they forget that God commands us to work. Work was God's idea, even before the fall. Work is not a result of the fall. The unpleasantness of work is a result of the fall. When we first meet God, he is working. Even God rested after working, it says, for 6 days. We forget that Jesus was a worker. I mean, think about it. He started his apprenticeship when he was 12, worked as a small business owner and a craftsman until he was 30. So my friend Paul Marshall says that Jesus probably spent more of his life sawing boards than he did preaching sermons. John White points out that most great saints are known for their hard work. He says, nothing has ever been done for God without work. Paul worked harder than all of them, 1 Corinthians 15:10. Wesley often preached several, he averaged 5 sermons a day for his lifetime. And White says, the one thing all great men and women have in common is they worked. Godly leaders work hard. Now, I'm not saying we don't take time off. I'm not saying we kill ourselves, but I am saying, sadly, many Christian workers and pastors are known for their slow pace. In America, many pastors are known for their low productivity, their laziness, because nobody checks on them. There's no accountability. I find business owners and entrepreneurs work far harder than most pastors I know. So let's slow down here for a minute and just ask this bigger question. How does God's work relate to our work, since we're seeing this wall being built? And in the church, we have people kind of at two ends of the spectrum. We have some people that say, well, God is all powerful, and he is, and he's promised to do this work. So all I have to do is wait and watch for God to do his part. That's what we call presuming upon God. We've got other people, a whole bunch of people in America especially, who say, well, God is kind of peripheral of this whole thing. It all depends on me. So I'll do it all and then ask him to bless what I've done. But the biblical balance is to pray for God's help and to work, doing what we can. And we call this divine human synergy, because God often uses our work to accomplish his work. God created us to work, and we have work to do that he will not do without us. And our work is not in opposition in any way to what God is doing. I mean, think about it. It all started in the Garden of Eden when God commanded Adam to take care of the garden. Now, I got to tell you, God had just finished flinging the planets from his fingertips, and he created this earth and all the stuff on it, the dirt and the trees and the animals. And then he turns to Adam and says, okay, dude, you take care of the garden. And I got to tell you, if I'd been Adam with an attitude, which obviously he had, I'd have probably said, really? Really? You're telling me to take care of that? I mean, really, God, you just finished creating all this with the word of your mouth. I really think, with all due respect, I think it'd be a lot easier if you could just take care of the garden, if you please. But no, that wasn't how God made the situation, because he created Adam and us for work and for responsibility. So we see this balance all the way through chapter 4, especially the divine human synergy. So let's pop into chapter 4 and read verses 7 through 9. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against them. But we prayed to our God, that's divine, and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. That's the human part of the synergy. Jump to verse 12. Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack us. Wherever you turn, they will attack us. Wherever you turn, they will attack us. Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. That's human. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome. That's divine. And then verse 16. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other, and each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. Human. Do you see the divine human synergy through there? These godly people had no problem that God had promised them help, but they had to do some hard work. And it's interesting, these three words, doors, bolts, and bars, appear all the way through chapter 3. Yeah, there were bad people in the neighborhood back then. They had to lock their doors too, but they had to put bolts and bars on the door. Now, it's interesting. Just let me share this with you before we close. Martin Luther called this divine human synergy he calls our work God's mask. And I love his commentary on Psalm 147, where God says in verses 13 and 14, he strengthens the bars of your gates and blesses your people within you. He grants peace to your borders and satisfies you with the finest of wheat. But of course, you have to build the gates, and then he'll use the gates to protect you, and you have to plant the wheat and harvest it, but he will give you that food. Well, let me let Luther say it in his own words. He said, what else is all our work besides, what else is all our work to God? These are the masks of God behind which he wants to remain concealed and do all things. Make the bars and gates and let him fasten them. Labor and let him give the fruits. Govern and let him give his blessings. Fight and let him give the victory. Preach and let him win hearts. In all our doings, he is to work through us, and he alone shall have the glory from it. So we work, and that's God's mask. Years ago, I heard this funny little story about a city slicker who came down to admire the well-kept garden of the old farmer. perfectly tilled garden, no weeds, straight rows. And the super spiritual city guy said, "That's a beautiful garden you and God have there." And the old farmer kind of kicked his boot in the dirt and thought a little bit. And he said, "Yep, but you should have seen it when God had it to himself." And that's the situation of the situation of Jerusalem. That's the situation of Compass Europe. Is Compass Europe a divinely planted mission? Yes, it is. Is it God's will that it prosper and spread across all of Europe? Yes, it is. But he's given us a key part in that work. So, do you want to be a godly leader? Then how do we do that? We grow in prudence and wisdom. We do our research. We articulate the problem and the solution. We don't demand or command. We motivate. We carefully plan and organize. We recruit good workers, and we work hard. Now, several of you have said you enjoy Nehemiah. Here's 3 commentaries that I really enjoy on Nehemiah. There's other good ones, but these are ones that might be of interest to you. And you'll be getting all these PowerPoint slides later on. So let's talk together. What is one problem you need to solve right now in your work or your organization? And what part of your leadership would you most like to change in light of Nehemiah's example? Thank you so much. Let's talk.